I want to thank you for joining us again for our midweek Bible study as we continue through the book of Ezekiel together, the powerful messages of God to his people, and how God reveals so much about himself and his nature and character through not only the prophecies, but the visions and the way in which he appears in the book. And he continues here in chapters 34 through 36 as he brings himself to the people in a new picture that we'll see as we move along. So let me get our screen share going. And we will pick up in Ezekiel chapter 34, if you want to go ahead and be turning to that. First, I wanted to, those who saw or listened to Sunday's sermon, saw my picture of my brother Steve. This was taken a few months before he died a few years ago. And this is with his rescue horse, Dakota. He was a great animal lover and got into animal rescue, and especially of horses, in the latter years of his life. And when he found Dakota, he was malnourished, he was weak and sick, and because his previous owner had taken a rope with a large knot on the end of it and beat him repeatedly on the side of his head, he was blind in both eyes. And I introduced that to you to bring us to this cruelty that is so evident in our world. Those in positions to take advantage of others in the way in which they treat them, whether it's animal abuse, whether it's child abuse, whether it is sexual abuse within families, or by other people who are in authority over young people, whether it's those who are caught up in the sex trafficking trade. There are just so many elements of misuses of power and position to take advantage of those who are weak. And that is the situation we find being discussed here in Ezekiel chapter 34. As we move from a message that has been very much about gloom and doom, judgment on Jerusalem, now to more of a message of hope in which God begins to reveal through Ezekiel his good news of what he is going to do for his people, and reveals himself not in terms of a great throne room of God descending upon the earth in bolts of lightning and fire and glory and majesty, or as the judge of Israel, but now as a shepherd. But in doing so, the first thing he wants to do is talk about the shepherds, those who have been given responsibility on a human level of shepherding his people here on earth, and how badly they had done so. But as we begin, I want us to read through quickly Psalm 23, because there's imagery here that plays an important part in this vision, and in turn, both Psalm 23 and Ezekiel 34 give background material to John chapter 10, when Jesus talks about being the good shepherd. David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." David, one who grew up being a shepherd, writes this from the perspective of now being the sheep and seeing God as the great shepherd. And he draws us this beautiful picture of the care and concern and protection that shepherds provide for their sheep. But that's not what had been happening in Israel. In fact, he begins in the first 10 verses of chapter 34 of talking about just how selfish the shepherds are. In fact, he describes them as being woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally, and so they have been scattered, because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the world. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill, and they were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Such a sad picture that people who had been put in those positions of strength or power had used it only for their own selfish desires and concerns. And in fact, they were using the sheep themselves only to benefit themselves, and didn't have any concern for those who were in the weak positions, especially those who were in need of help. And this goes totally against the picture of the shepherd drawn in Psalm 23 and in other places, and of Jesus's description of himself as the good shepherd in John 10. And so, because the sheep are not receiving shepherding, they're not seeing any concern for their needs. They are scattered around the world. But he goes on in those last verses 7 through 10 to tell them that he will hold them accountable. Verse 10, I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock and remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will hold you accountable for my flock. And this is the first reference which he is going to continue to make throughout the rest of this chapter and in chapter 36, of that reminder to them, not just the leaders in Jerusalem, but the exiles who are with Ezekiel, that the flock is his. His people belong to him. They do not belong to the human leaders whom he has given responsibility. And so, consequently, he says, starting in verse 11, I, as the good shepherd, am going to search for you. I am going to rescue you, and I will pasture you, and I will give them rest. So much imagery from Psalm 23, but also imagery of the need for going out and searching for those who have been lost and who have been scattered. Verse 12, as a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep, and I will rescue them from all the places they have scattered on the days of darkness. And he talks about bringing them in and pasturing them. And in the end, he will care for the weak. I will search for the lost and bring them back. Verse 16, and I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. Jesus draws upon this image of the sheep needing to be searched for in Luke chapter 15, when he talks about, if a shepherd has 100 sheep and one is lost, does he not leave the 99 behind to go search for the one? Because that's the vulnerable one. That's the one that's in the weak position. The others are secure and have been taken care of. But there is one out there who is weak. And so he goes and finds him and brings him back. And there is rejoicing over the one who was lost and is now found. But God keeps referring to this is something he is going to do. And when Israel comes back from captivity in 536, they never rule themselves again, though they are given some basic authority to rule over themselves within a certain territory and within a certain range. But they are always dominated by some other nation, whether it is now Babylon, and later it's going to be Persia, then it's going to be Greece, and then it will be Rome. But within that, God secures them. He brings them together. He gives them pasture, and he cares for his people, even in times of difficulty and struggle, and wants them to continue doing the same for each other, and especially in caring for the weak. If we skip down to verses 23 and 24, he sort of moves ahead in time to when he will give them the one shepherd will be his servant David, and he will tend them and will be a prince among them. This is a theme in prophesying the coming of Jesus that will be picked up at the end of chapter 37 in more detail, and we're going to save that for next week when we look at chapter 37 as a whole. But he says, not only am I going to do this because they are my flock, and then I am going to send them my shepherd, my servant, a descendant of David, and he will watch over them and tend them and be the one to whom they report and to whom they worship. But in between those verses, he gives a stern warning to the members of the flock that he's going to bring back, that they have a responsibility to each other, even though he is the one bringing them together. And there is a coming good shepherd, descendant of David. They still have responsibility, and they're going to be those who are in positions of authority between them. He says, you are responsible for how you decide to act within the flock. And so again, it comes back to that personal responsibility that is emphasized throughout Ezekiel. And he says, and I'm going to judge between the lean and the fat. He closed verse 16 with, I will shepherd the flock with justice. It continues then in verse 17. As for you, my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, between rams and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the rest of your pasture with your feet? Is it not enough that you drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Therefore, he says, I myself would judge between the fat and the lean sheep, because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horns until they are driven away. But I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. And I will judge between one sheep and another. And then he goes into his reference to the shepherd who is a descendant of David and is coming in the future. So he says, those of you who are in the fat position, the strong position, I'm going to be watching you. Are you just pushing for position? And that's how we see people in the world. Jesus told his disciples, the world rules by power and position. They seek themselves first, but this is not how you are to. You are to be first a servant. He himself talks about in his own ministry, he did not come to be served, but to serve. But whether we're in positions of influence or leadership or not, if we're only out concerned for ourselves and not for others, and we're always just pushing for position and what we can gain for ourselves, whether in the world or in the church amongst the people of God, he says, I will judge you for that. And I will save my flock. Again, it's my flock. It is not your flock. It is not your church. It is mine. And I am going to carry out my plan, and I am going to save those who are faithful to me. In fact, he says, I am going to create an environment in which the sheep who are following the shepherd have this healthy environment. The end of chapter 34 describes a healing taking place in the land where it becomes plentiful again, where it has been savaged in the past. He talks about in chapter 36 a reference to it becoming like the Garden of Eden again. And so he says, under a covenant of peace, I am going to give you good pasture. And then he picks up in chapter 36, again, with the concept of all that he is going to do for the sheep to help them be healthy. Before we go to that, I will mention the whole idea of allowing the land to rest was something that was part of the law. Within the Mosaic law, every seventh year, they were to let the land rest and not plant anything and just live off what was still growing by itself or what they had stored up, which was a real act of faith when you have to say, okay, well, I'm not going to plant anything this year and believe God's going to take care of us. Then after 7 sevens, after the 49th year, when there has been a regular time of no planting, in the 50th year was the year of Jubilee, in which they, for the second consecutive year, did not plant to allow the land to rest and to heal, and so that it could continue to be productive for them in the future. And it's kind of the picture that we see given here, even in the last few verses of 2nd Chronicles, as the writer is talking about all the people being carried off into captivity after Jerusalem is defeated and destroyed. He talks about the land then had a Sabbath rest. And it was from the time Jerusalem is destroyed in 586 to the time the captives are allowed to return by the Persians in 536, we have a 50-year rest of the land. But he goes on to remind them of what else he's going to do. Part of the covenant of peace is covered in chapter 35 and the first part of chapter 36, where he goes back. He had briefly mentioned the judgment upon Edom back in chapter 25 when he's talking about all the surrounding nations. But he returns to that theme here, I think, because it's part of him showing them how he is going to create a peaceful place and a good pasture for them to live, and goes into more detail about his judgment upon Edom, because he says they have had an ancient hostility toward my people, and they have sought to harm them in so many ways. And in fact, we're told in verse 5 of chapter 36 that in my burning zeal, I have spoken against the rest of the nations and against all Edom. For with glee and with malice in their hearts, they made my land their possession so that they might plunder its pasture land. They took it upon a greedy approach to here was land that they could possess themselves for their own pastures. And God says, no, in my judgment, you will be destroyed as well. You will not return and become a nation again, as Israel will. And the land will return to a time of prosperity and growth, so that the sheep that he brings back and that he has made healthy by reaching out to the weak, he says in verse 24, I'm going to take you out of the nations, gather you from all the countries, bring you back to your own land, and sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols, and I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and careful to keep my laws. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers, and you will be my people, and I will be your God. I will save you from all your uncleanness, and I will call for the grain and make it plentiful and not bring famine upon you. Because he not only is going to clean them, but give them this new heart, this new spirit, powerful prophecy of not only how he was going to bring them home in the immediate future, but the long-term plan of him being able to cleanse us completely from our impurities and give us a new heart and a new spirit through faith in his son Jesus. And he reminds them then in verse 32, and I want you to know that I'm not doing this for your sake, declares the sovereign Lord. Be shamed and disgraced. And he goes on to talk about this is I, the Lord, have rebuilt and have destroyed and have replanted what was desolate. I, the Lord, have spoken and I will do it. I want everyone to know this is for my name's sake. It's not because you're so special and that you deserve this. This is simply God keeping his covenant promise to his covenant people. And it is for his name's sake that he will carry all this out. In fact, at the end, he says, once again, I will yield to the plea of the house of Israel and do this for them. And I will make their people as numerous as sheep, as numerous as the flocks for offerings at Jerusalem during her appointed feast. Again, bringing it all together under the beautiful picture of a caring, loving shepherd, in contrast to those human shepherds who had been so selfish, so self-oriented, and cared nothing about the weak. In fact, they sought to exploit them. And we see this throughout history. We've seen it in our own country. People seeking to exploit others, especially those who are in positions of weakness. But God has always had a special heart for those people. And we must never forget that, because God's desire has always been to seek and save the lost. From the time of the garden, he has sought to reach out to us after our sin and to bring us back into relationship with him. His desire for choosing Abraham to create a nation from him was so that through them, all the other nations would see the glory of God and turn to him and be saved. But they had failed miserably in doing so. In fact, they had become worse than the nations around them, as we've seen in Ezekiel. This has always been God's desire. And as Jesus said in his own ministry, that's why I have come, is to seek and save the lost. And he has always shown greater concern for those who are in the weak position. He even reminds them when they're brought out of Egypt, as part of the law, that they were not to show any disfavor or mistreat aliens or immigrants of any kind because of the way in which they had been treated in Egypt. It had started out great. It was a place of protection. But then because of people's worry and concern about this growing population within them as being dangerous, they started to enslave them and take advantage of them. And he says, and you're never to do that to anybody else. And yet they had done that very thing. There are constant references throughout Scripture, old and new, about concern for widows and orphans and the poor and the hungry, and making sure that they are taken care of and that there is a concern for them. And yet, so much of the time in our world, this is not how this is approached. Everybody is jockeying, they're pushing for position of getting their position, their place, their desires cared for, not just in the world, but in churches as well. And I've seen churches damaged terribly because people in leadership positions, shepherds, have not really been concerned about the needs of the flock, but more concerned about their desires and what they want. But we look around us in our world, and we look at our ministries here at Pine Valley, and we want to make sure that we have that same concern for those who are weak around us, of our own flock and in the world around us. Those sheep that are of another flock, as Jesus describes them in John 10. And that's what we've been seeking to do, whether it is seeking to help those who are homeless through our work at Good Shepherd. Those lives matter. And this is a statement I made on Sunday. To God, all lives matter. That is an appropriate biblical statement. All lives matter. But we must never forget that God has always had this greater concern for the weak. And so homeless lives really matter. And the lives of homeless veterans matter. The lives of those who have physical and mental disabilities as those who live at Lakeside Reserve matter to him. Uh, Lives of the homeless and the poor and the hungry matter. The lives of those women who have been uh, destroyed by being taken into the sex trafficking business uh, matter to him. And it is appropriate to go ahead and mention those by name because it makes us think about them. If we just say all lives matter, that can easily be something that we use to dismiss concern about other groups and be still more focused on what we want. God has no problem with listing out for us those lives that matter. And so it is very appropriate in our day and time to list these groups that are vulnerable and they're weak. It's appropriate for us to say unborn lives matter. And it's also appropriate to say Black lives matter and brown lives matter and lives of color matter. Not saying that from the point of supporting any political group, but from a biblical perspective, this is the heart of God. And people of color in this country have suffered greatly because they have always been kept in a position of weakness. And it is our job as the people of God to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and reach out to them and show real concern for them and help them. Because as a middle-class white man, I have not faced many of the obstacles and problems in my life that my brothers and sisters of color have faced in theirs, simply because I'm white and they are not. And that is wrong, and it is something that we must face. It is something we must go write on a list, make a prayer list, list out these different groups that are of true concern to you. It doesn't have to be extensive, but just write out the list that makes you think about those groups that are in those places of weakness and who need help and healing, so that you'll pray for them and think about them every day and not just try to hide behind a sweeping statement. Yes, God loves all lives. All lives matter to him. He wants all lives to matter the same way to us as they do to him, which means we give greater concern to those in the weak position. And as we saw at the end, he promises to provide for the health and safety of his people. And he always has, and he always will. And that's the picture that Jesus picks up on in John chapter 10. And I just want to close by looking at that together. Let me get out of this one and we'll go to a different screen. And this is from John chapter 10. Let's read through this together. Beginning in verse 7, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep, and all who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd, and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks and the flock is scattered. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen, and I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason the Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Let's move on down to verse 25 and 26. The works I do in my Father's name testify about me, but you do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. And I and my Father are one. There is a statement of hope and security and health that can be found in following the Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, who came to earth to show us his love, his mercy, his care, his concern. And let's follow him each and every day, listening to his voice that calls us to submit, to deny self, and put his desires first and foremost in our lives, which includes love our neighbor as ourself. Reach out to those who are needy and in weak positions. Pray for them. Do what you can to help them. Let us not be the ones who continue to seek to oppress others or worry about some group becoming more powerful because their numbers are growing, like the Egyptians did with the Israelites. Let us seek to do the will of God in all of these things as we follow his son Jesus each and every day. I look forward to our study next week. It will be focusing on Ezekiel chapter 37. I encourage you to be reading ahead. And again, thank you for joining me today. God bless.